So I want to take you back to the summer of 1977.
Okay.
Can you think of where you were?
Summer of 1970, that was the year before I was going to go to college.
And what did you spend your summer doing?
Well, I was a different sort. Before that summer, I had gone off to Emory University and to look at the school, and that's where I ended up going to college for a couple of years. And when I went there, I sat in on 3 different classes, and one of them was on calculus. And at the time, I was having, I had just finished my Algebra 2 class, which was the class you study to go into calculus. And so I was expecting to go off and study calculus in college. So I said, well, I'm going to maybe study this a little bit. So I asked Dad if he could go off and get me a calculus book. So he went off before work and went off to a bookstore and bought me a book. And he brought it home, and it was called Schaum's Advanced Calculus Outline.
Advanced?
Advanced. And I'm going, I don't think I'm advanced because I don't really understand the subject at all. So I read the first chapter, and it was a review of basic algebra and all that to get you prepared for calculus. And then I opened the second chapter, and I kind of looked at it, and I was going, I don't think I understand any of this. So I went over to San Diego State. I grew up in California in San Diego, and so I went to San Diego State, and I picked up a used calculus book. And so that was my first light reading. And the other was that I got a book on biochemistry. It's one of these big fat things that, has 1,000 pages. So I said, well, I'll do some reading on calculus and biochemistry for my summer.
And that was your summer vacation?
Yes. Well, I went to Colorado and we traveled around, but basically I had those 2 books with me. And in fact, when I went up, my calculus book was sitting on, not my calculus, my biochemistry book was sitting on an ice chest, and there was a big bucket of water, and she lifted it up without putting my biochemistry book on the floor, and it slid into the bucket, and I still have it today. It swelled up, and I was not a happy camper. But yeah, I was doing other things, but I was spending a lot of time just enjoying reading biochemistry and calculus. So yeah, that's what I did for my summer vacation.
Okay. And so after vacation ended, summer ended, you left California and you went to Georgia.
I went to Georgia. A very good friend of my dad's recommended Emory. He had gone to Emory University. And so I got on a plane and flew to Georgia, Atlanta. And I got there, and by that time I had read about 500 pages of calculus during the summer, and I had gotten up through infinite series and all the rest of it. And so they signed me up for all my classes, and one of them was calculus. It was on a quarterly basis, instead of semester basis. So they were short, and you had 3 different classes, and you did them for 10 weeks. So I went in and I said, I need to get calculus. So they signed me up in calculus. And so I was in this calculus. I forget what the other 2 classes were. I think one was introductory chemistry, and then another was probably a psychology class, a physiological psychology class, but I can't remember right offhand. But I sat in calculus, and I had class Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I got in the class, and I was sitting there. And the teacher, very good teacher, started talking about the limits and, a ratio of limits and all that. And I'm going, okay, yes, that's all real wonderful and fine, but heavens, this is old stuff. I studied that 3 months ago. So I sat there and listened to him for a while, and I took a little notes, and then, all right, well, maybe go speed up on next class. So next class, he comes in and starts talking about limits again, and more subtleties. And I'm going, okay. And so Friday finally rolls around, and I'm going, this is not exciting. I already studied this stuff. So I raised my hand at the end. At the end of class, I was being a little smart alecky, but I sat there, but I waited until the end of the class. So it was about 5 minutes, and he had pulled up another example of a ratio of limits, and one of them, I think the bottom was going off to infinity. I can't remember the equation in particular, but I raised my hand and I said, Doctor, I was just wondering, could you apply, I think, I can never pronounce this name right. I've been studying it for so long, but I think it's El Hospital's law. I can't ever remember the fellow's name. It's named after a brilliant mathematician. And I said, couldn't you use El Hospital's rule on that? And I mean, if you do, you can differentiate the top and you get blah, blah, blah. And if you differentiate the bottom, blah, blah, blah. And now your ratio of equations doesn't run off to infinity and you get a finite answer, And he's gone. And he kind of looked at me and he said, well, young man, yes. This was a very long time ago when I was a young man myself. And he said, yes, young man, you can do that. But generally, you wait until second quarter of calculus to learn the El Hospital law. You have to go from this to all this stuff. Can I? And then he said, can I talk to you after class? And I said, by all means. And so I went up to him and he says, what are you doing in this class? I mean, if you know Hospital's rule and you know how to resolve the differentials here, and you did it right, by the way, why are you here? And I said, well, I picked up a calculus book over the summer. And he said, you didn't have calculus in high school or anything? No, I just picked it up and learned it on my own. And he goes, oh, okay, well, all right, well, that's okay. And then he asked, how far are you? And I said, well, I'm now through studying infinite series, convergent and divergent series, and that sort of thing. And that is built on, if you know anything about calculus, that it's built on differentials and so forth. And he goes, well, yeah, that's interesting, because the people that go into calculus from high school, and this is back, I think they go faster now for the young people, but back then they would put you in third quarter. So, the first 2 quarters, and then if you had calculus in high school, then they would put you in the third quarter of calculus. And that's where you would learn about infinite series and all the rest of it. He says, basically, it sounds like you're past that point. I said, well, yes, I guess so. And he says, well, I think the next stop for you is differential equations. So, okay. So they signed me up to differential equations, and they told me, I don't know if it's certain or not, but they said, well, you're the first high school student to jump the entire first year of calculus at Emory and go into differential equations. I go, oh, okay. So I get in there, and I'm in with there were a few sophomores, but mostly sophomores, but there were mostly juniors and seniors in this class. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this, and I start doing it, and okay, and I'm starting to look at these problems and that sort of thing. And so the first test and the second test, I was kind of bouncing around right at about a C- level. But towards the end of it, it all clicked for me. All the pieces made sense. And the teacher the professor came up and said, we may have jumped you ahead on this calculus, differential. Too far. And I said, no. I think I finally got it. I can do this. So, okay. So I go in and I remember there were 6 problems on the final. And you only had to do 4 of them. So I said, okay. So I did the first one. I did the second one. I did the third one. I did the fourth one. And I can do this 5th one too. So I did the 5th one. And then I went on to the 6th one, and I did the 6th one. And I handed it in. I had to do 4, but I did 6. And I got like a 98%, 98 out of 100 on the test. Well, if we average your first two tests with your last one, you probably get a B. But you did such a stellar job on your final. I think I got like an A- on the class. And so that's kind of my first quarter in calculus.
That was the first quarter?
First
quarter of your first year
at Emory.
And how long did you end up going to Emory?
I went to Emory for 2.5 years.
Okay. And you studied, what were you majoring in?
I was majoring in chemistry, but I'm curious about everything. And they had a very good program on what is called physiological psychology, and strong in psychology. So, but I wasn't interested in, at that point, I now am, but I wasn't interested much in Freud and Jung. It didn't make sense to me. But I loved neurobiology. I had already read a lot about the ideas before I'd gotten off to college, and so I understood the basics of neurobiology. So the idea is you study the physiological structures and correlate them to the psychology of the behavior and how different functions in your brain fire up on your body, and it affects your behavior and that sort of thing. And they called it physiological psychology. So I was going to major in chemistry. Both my parents are still doctors. Well, they're retired long time now, but they were both doctors, and I was thinking I was going to be a doctor and that sort of thing. So I said, well, I'll start with chemistry. But I threw in physiological psychology, and then there was mathematics, and obviously I just explained how I kind of jumped in and started taking more and more advanced classes in mathematics and that sort of thing, and I really, truly loved that. So it was a tight race, but I was going to do it in chemistry and then studying physiological psychology, and then I was taking a lot of mathematics and a little additional biology and that sort of thing. So that's kind of my first 2.5 years in the university.
Well, after calculus, how did you do in your other courses?
For the most part, I was getting solid A's, a few B's thrown in there. I suffer from what is called dyslexia, and so when I hit the humanities and I had to write papers and all the rest of it, I love the books and that sort of thing, but when it came time to write the papers, and I kind of pushed those off, and so that's one of the reasons that I never quite got a degree. I never got all the humanities and that sort of thing, but I did have a few of them, and I always was I enjoyed the reading and that sort of thing, but I wasn't at that time a very good writer, especially with my dyslexia and spelling and so forth. So I was scattering a few B's in there, but mostly A's, solid A's and that sort of thing.
And so something happened. You ended up leaving Emory, but
yes.
Tell a story about that.
All right. Well, my nature is I don't like just to memorize. I like to take and understand the basic ideas of what is going on in the subject. And so if they're rational subjects, there are defining concepts that make up that subject. Now, obviously, they're in basic physics, you've got the concepts of force and momentum and all that. And then in chemistry, you have well-defined concepts. Well, the class that I got into, and looking back on it, I should have had some earlier prerequisites. I was going to get my degree in chemistry, and I had already gone through organic chemistry and biochemistry and analytical chemistry, analytical chemistry, and all. I had a dozen classes already behind me on chemistry, but I hit physical chemistry, and I could understand the equations. The equations were fairly straightforward. They're not the most advanced equations, especially after you've studied differential equations and all. But what happened is that I didn't click to the concepts. It was, you use these equations and these equations and you get this result. And I knew that there was something happening underneath, but I didn't get it. And the further I went into the class, the more desperate I became. And it was the first time I had ever gotten into something that wasn't making sense. And at the time, I'll admit, I wish I had someone that had encouraged me to don't worry about it. But I was so high-strung. I was on this course, and I had set these goals for myself, and they were so unrealistic. And I had also taken so many of these courses that I was getting close to being burned out on all of this stuff. But I had set my expectations so high that when I finally hit a subject that I really didn't understand, not only did I suddenly not perform in the class, but I also was not performing at my levels of what I thought. And so I had a complete collapse. And
what was that? What kind of collapse? Explain that.
I had an A minus, A to A minus average. I was doing well. And suddenly I found myself facing a C minus. And unlike the differential equations of 2.5 years before, I didn't get it. And I knew that what I was looking at, that even when I got to the final, I wasn't going to do well. And so here was my first failure. And my ego wasn't as strong as it should have been. And so that collapsed my self-esteem at the time. And so I went into a certain amount of depression, which is not unusual for an individual of that age, 20, 21. You have your goals in life. You think you know what the world is all about. And then for the first time you hit something that doesn't fit. And so it fell apart on me. And psychologically, I couldn't deal with it, and so I had to leave school for a while to recover. But what was interesting is that my nature was that was like a bone I got. I couldn't give it up. Even though it caused all this problem, I said, why didn't I get that? It's in there. It's a basis of modern chemistry. I know something is going on here. I just don't get it. So I eventually went back to it. And this is years and years ago. But now I to a certain extent, hold the school responsible for this. I mean, they were my guides. They were meant to be my guided tour through knowledge and that sort of thing. And they even referred to the class as I forget what it was called, the killer class. It wasn't that, but it was, they wanted to weed out a certain number of the chemistry students. So this physical chemistry was the weed out course.
So you thought you were being weeded out?
I was being weeded out. I was weeded out. It did.
But didn't later you learn that there was a class you should have had that they didn't tell you about?
Yes, and that's what I'm getting at.
Okay.
For those out there, if you're about to take physical chemistry, I have one word to say to you: thermodynamics. Have at least 1 quarter or semester, and if not possible, 2 semesters in thermodynamics. The study of heat and energy, and understand the postulatory structure of thermodynamics, all 3 of them, and have that really grasp. And basically, it's a study. It's a science. Well, we'll deal with the concept of science in a little bit, but for general terms, for now, have the science of heat and what is understood about heat as an energy source and how it transfers through space and time in your belt, under your belt. Then you go to chemistry. And by the way, I have since found out I never had a clear. I knew it, I understood it, and I understood atoms and all that. But it was many years later that I also came to realize chemistry is nothing more and nothing less than the study of the behavior of the outer electrons of atoms. And so what happens is that physical chemistry is the merger of the study of outer electrons and their changes over time as measured by energy and heat. And so you merge thermodynamics and chemistry. And it's a deep, profound fusion of those two subjects. And that gives modern basis, or one of the modern basis, to chemistry. And makes it a hard, fast science that has allowed us to create much of our modern world. But at the time, I didn't know that, and it went. My life for a while went kaplunk.
So you went home.
I went home. Yes.
And how long was it before you were able to regain your sense of ego? And
it was the next year. I had about 6 months, and then I went back. Living in California, I applied and I entered a UCSD. Then I changed my degree from chemistry to electrical engineering, and so I was there for about a year and a half and studied.
What year was that? 80, 81?
It was about 80, 81, because it was right around, so 78, 79, 80, then 81. And then I went through 1981 through their electrical engineering department. And then I went, the second year I was studying EM fields and that sort of thing. And also studying statistical and stoic processes, as they say, statistics, and the third major branch of mathematics that is essential for understanding physics. And so I went back for a year and a half.
Okay. Do you have any idea how close you were to getting a degree?
If you added all the courses up, I'm probably pretty close in the physical sciences. What I have heard about the European education system, where they don't require the humanities as much as they do here in the United States, or at least back then, I probably have enough of the sciences to qualify for a bachelor's in the area of sciences and that sort of thing. But here in the United States, I did not have all the social science classes that are required. So I would be considered reasonably close, but that was so many years ago. It's kind of interesting.
Okay, so something I think happened then, so that you didn't go and finish that.
That's correct.
So explain what happened then.
Okay. In my second quarter, UCSD also had the quarter system instead of the semester system. And in the second quarter of electromagnetism, I happened to be sitting outside the class waiting for the professor. I do remember him, Dr. Booker, old fellow, must have been close to 80 when he was teaching this class. And he had a wonderful series of 3 books that he had written that I still, everything that I've ever seen or looked at in EM theory and all that, I still think that his books are by far the best. And they were paper bound, and that sort of thing. And you bought them from the UCSD library. And unfortunately, I lost the first two quarters. He had 3 of them, and they were each for each of the quarters. And I've lost 2 of them. I would dearly love to be able to
The books you lost?
Yeah, the books. And
I think I saw one. Was it Lectures in Physics or something like that? Was that not
no, it was EM theory and energy, or something along those lines. And he did such a wonderful job of what is a very difficult science to wrap your head around. It was, I won't go into the details right now, but it was the science, it was the physics that changed us to the modern world, took us from the thermodynamics, which I was talking about earlier, and energy, and cast it into a whole new realm. And it's an amazing subject. And Dr. Booker did such a wonderful job. And he was one of the brilliant men that worked on the Manhattan Project, on the triggers and all the rest of it. And so he was absolutely outstanding and brilliant. But I was sitting in waiting for him to come and open the class up, and I was talking to another student about business. And I've always been interested in stocks and bonds and business, because my dad has always been, and my grandparents have always been involved in that area and investing and that sort of thing. And I happened to be overheard by this gentleman. I still remember him to this day, for what he did for me, and his name. And so he came over and said, "You sound interested in business and finance and that sort of thing." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Would you be interested in a new way of doing business, a new business theory?" I said, "Well, I'm always interested. That's intriguing." So he says, "I have 3 sessions that you can buy. It's part of a 19 sessions course, but you can just, to find out what it's about, you can go to the first 3." And I do remember that this must have been on a Monday. Yeah, it was on a Monday. And we had the class in the morning. So I was supposed to meet him, and he was someone I had just met. And the rest of my day backed up, and I was supposed to meet him that day in the afternoon. And I did something I shouldn't have, and that is I missed it. But thank goodness Steve Yamamoto was more persistent than most. And he came back on Wednesday, and he said, "I thought you were going to want to hear this class." And I said, "Oh," and I was very sorry. I said, "Oh, I definitely do." And he says, "Well, there's another start of the class. They're running. It runs every week. It's once a week, and they start it once on Monday and once on Wednesday. So you have a chance to go tonight." And I said, "Okay, I will be there." So I made a point of it, and I was there, and he was there, and we drove down to downtown San Diego into one of the tall skyscrapers or tall buildings down there, and we went up to, I think, like the 34th floor. And that is when I had the opportunity to first hear Andrew Galambos, someone who, even to this day, with all of and everything that I have ever studied, I consider him the greatest intellect of the 20th century. He is the most creative genius. And he's not just the greatest genius in the 20th century. I know that he rates with Newton, Archimedes, Maxwell, these stellar, unusual, brilliant men. And I had my opportunity of hearing Professor Galambos for the first time on that Wednesday.
Was he live? Was he there in San Diego?
No, he wasn't in San Diego. He was located in Los Angeles. And by this time, he was developing what he called a new social science. And he did not use the term social science. He referred to social science, but he called it volitional science. And by that point, when I came involved with his theory, he had traveled very much further along. It would be like having Isaac Newton repeating the introduction to basic physics over and over and over again. That would be a colossal waste of human capacity. So what he had done is that he had recorded his lectures. He eventually wanted to translate it into his magnum opus. But at the time, he was using reel-to-reel tapes and was recording his lectures so he could present all of his insights and brilliant thinking. And so I went downtown to San Diego, and they had someone who was dedicated to providing these courses. And so I sat up on this 32nd floor of this building in a office, actually a conference room, and looking out over San Diego, which I still think is a beautiful city, and listen to some of the most eye-opening knowledge that I had ever been exposed to. And that's saying something, because I was just in the process of seeing the brilliance of Maxwell and Faraday and all the rest of them lay out electromagnetism and develop field theory. So I was studying that, and then I studied the new ways that we can structure our civilization. And as Professor said, he always said, our problem is that as a species, we have gotten so smart that we can kill ourselves many times over. Yet we haven't gotten smart enough to stop it. And that's what was his motivation for developing his knowledge base. He was by training a physicist, a mathematical physicist, and also a rocket engineer, a rocket scientist. And later I learned that he was the one that developed the first viable methods of first stage optimization in rockets leaving in the atmosphere. He was absolutely brilliant, and he produced this revolutionary way of looking how human civilization started. And once I got involved with that, the interest that the university had, the appeal, which was still pretty strong. I love the basic physics and sciences and all the rest of it. But here was the cutting edge of where human knowledge was going next, human understanding. And so I dove into that. And for the next 2 years after that, I got my grounding in that subject.